All right, cool. So we're live back again on Friday night. We're doing these gardening lives to answer some gardening questions, and then we typically will cover one or two topics during that live. Last week's live we did some microgreen starting, so I showed you guys how to start microgreens. Walked you through that whole process. My wife and I did microgreens for at both farms that we farmed at, and we're pretty successful at it. And so I wanted to, last week I was excited to show everybody that video. This week I've got the whiteboard out behind me here, and we're going to be talking about seed spacing. So I'm sure all of you are getting your starts and getting your gardens ready right now. And one thing I learned when I was just starting out with gardening was how important it was to space your seeds within so many inches from one another. And because we're in an urban setting where we're urban farming, we don't have a lot of space. So there's this thing called intensive spacing where you plant your plants really close together and you really maximize your harvest opportunity. And so that's what we do at our plot here. And then the other plot is we plant everything as close as we can together to really maximize our yield. So I thought it'd be a good topic to cover because this was a lot of the questions that I had early on were related to seed spacing and how close to plant everything. And once I figured this all out, it's just you get in how you even have to go back and look it up and stuff like that. So pretty important topic we're going to cover today. That's why I got the whiteboard out. I figured it'd be a good idea to kind of show you guys the different configurations that you can use in your garden space. Cool. So I wanted to start by just kind of talking about our week and what we did this week here on the farm. So we're still transplanting stuff. We're still flipping beds and getting new stuff in the ground. If you're wondering how to flip a bed or anything like that, go check out our YouTube channel, that gardening channel. I upload videos weekly with just minute-long videos with like garden tips. So go check that out. There's one that's all about how to flip a bed. So once you pull stuff out, put new stuff in, what that process looks like. We did a lot of that this week. We got some more of these. We've been building these raised beds that have legs on them because we have a lot of concrete at one of our plots. So instead of planting stuff directly on the concrete, I basically built these beds on legs, and I can kind of move them around all over the concrete as I please. So we did a lot of that this week. I built 2 of those beds and got those set up, and then we did something cool yesterday. So I have a buddy that I used to work the farmers markets with, and he sold olives. And we went and checked out his place yesterday, and he's got just under an acre, and it's a food forest. And so we're located in the Bay Area, and in 1989 there was a huge fire that rolled through the Oakland Hills and wiped out a ton of homes, and his home was one of the homes that got wiped out. And when they rebuilt the home, they started planting fruit trees. And his whole backyard, his whole almost 1 acre of land is just all fruit trees. And the trees are massive at this point because that was in 89, and here we are in 2022. You could only imagine how big these trees are. So you're walking through the paths and stuff, and there's just fruit trees kind of growing over your head, and you can just pick here and pick there, and he's got different stuff that comes at different times of the year, and it's a pretty cool setup. So Ashley went with me, the baby went with me, and it was pretty cool to see the little guy try all these cool fruits and veggies that we don't even grow here on our farm, and you don't find this stuff at the farmers market. So he was growing all sorts of different berries, loganberries, mulberries. He was growing blackberries, black raspberries, all sorts of different berries, and then he had a ton of fruit trees. He was growing papayas, bananas, mango. He had mango trees. This is stuff that you wouldn't think would grow here in the Bay Area, but he's had a lot of success with it. And one day I'd like to get out there and I'd like to do a video at his farm and kind of show you guys what his setup looks like, because it's pretty awesome. Yeah, so we did that yesterday, and then today it was just, I was doing just little things here on the yard, tying up all our tomatoes grow vertically. So I was stringing the tomatoes up. I was picking the suckers off the tomatoes, picking the suckers off my peppers, cucumbers, just getting everything situated so it will grow upwards. And then I think I've talked about this, but with like cucumbers, I always pick the first couple sets of flowers so that the cucumber can focus on root growth. So I was doing a lot of that this week. Did the same thing with the squash. I walk around my summer squash. I pick all the first flowers off. That way the plant can really focus on getting big first and then producing big fruit second. So yeah, a lot of that going on this week. And then, and then here we are today, Friday, back doing another live here. So I hope you guys enjoy me doing this. I know when I was first starting farming, I'd go to the nursery and I'd spend $1,000 on starts and stuff, just trying to get my garden ready, before I realized that I could just soil blocks, I could make my own soil mix, and I could start my own seeds and get my own operation going. So when you first starting out in the garden, you really don't know where to even start, right? And that was a question we had last week was, I'm so new to this, where do I even start? Well, where you start is, if you don't have seeds and you don't have soil, go to the nursery, get some starts, and just get stuff in the ground and learn from your mistakes, learn from the things you do that work very well. Have a notepad and write your notes. So every single year you have your notes from year after year after year after year, and you know how you've improved over the years, and you can take stuff out and leave stuff in. And that's really how you grow as a farmer. You're going to grow over time. You're not going to grow overnight. But these videos that I'm doing, they're really geared towards beginning farmers. So if you're brand spanking new to this and you know nothing, these are some tips you can pick up and get going right away. So today, what I wanted to focus on was talking about seed starting, seed spacing. So typically, when you're farming, you have your starts, right? So those starts are ready to go in the ground, but you have to know where you're going to put those in the ground, right? So I get up and I'm going to draw some stuff out here. Hopefully you guys can see this. So I'm going to draw up a couple examples. I'm going to draw something up first with just like your basic spacing if you want something to grow nice and big. So I'm going to draw up a lettuce head, okay, as an example. So typically how I space my lettuce heads out in a row is I do four in a row. So my beds are typically 30 inches. And then the length of it is just whatever I have for space. So a lot of my beds here, kind of vary in the actual length. But let's just use like 25 inches as an example. Now, the reason I plant in 30-inch beds is because as you're harvesting stuff, you want to make sure that you can basically situate yourself over the bed. So if I put one leg across and the other leg here, I can basically plant stuff directly under me, and I can harvest stuff directly under me. So 30 inches is like the perfect amount of space to straddle your bed. It makes everything else so much easier, because when you're gardening, one of the biggest problems is when you have to bend down like this on your knee and sit there and do stuff all day. It's bad on your back, it's bad on your knees, and then you get up and then it's bad on everything. So so it's important to, when you're setting up your beds, try to focus on setting those beds up within a 30-inch width. The length can be, whatever, but that's how all my beds are set up, is they're 30 inches, and then you have a walkway. Okay, so we'll do brown for the walkway. So then you typically have your walkway, which is going to look something like that. And the walkway can vary, depends on what you're trying to get through the walkway. If you have to get a wheelbarrow through this walkway, well, you're going to want to space that walkway out wider, right? So up at the property, when we were farming up north, we had a ton of space. So the walkway wasn't as big of a deal for us, but we needed to get wheelbarrows in there to dump dirt. So our walkways were typically 18 inches, but the walkways we're doing here on the urban farm are actually just a foot. So they're 12 inches. So depending on where you are and how much space you have would determine what you want your walkway to be. So 18 inches is what we did if you have a lot of space. I mean, if you have a ton of space, you could really go as wide as you want. You could make them 2 feet if you wanted to. Depends on what you're trying to get up and down that walkway. With a foot long, you can't really get much up the walkway other than yourself. And as stuff grows, like if your walkway is a foot and you're trying to grow like a summer squash or winter squash, that squash is going to eat up that whole walkway, and it's going to make it very difficult to walk in and out of that walk path. So this is kind of a little design. This is like a mini design course here. So you kind of give how you should design your farm. You've got your walkways to think about. You've got your bed spacing to think about. 2 important things. Okay, so let's go back to the spacing. So I've got my bed spaced out. So when I say I'm going to do 4 heads of lettuce, what I typically call that is in row. So if you hear the word, you're going to hear the word in row a lot. You're going to hear it. You're going to see it on your seed packs. You're going to see so many inches in row, or so many plants in row. So like with my lettuce, for example, I can typically, if I want a big head of lettuce, I can do 4 in row spacing. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. And all that saying is, on a 30-inch bed, I'm going to have 7.5 inches in between each plant, right? And then I'm going to have some spacing off the edge, because as the plant grows, you want the plant to not grow into your walkway. You want it to grow into dirt, right? So it's important to understand that spacing in between. So I'll space off from the edge. Now I typically won't space off from the edge the same as the spacing here. Sometimes I might cut this number in half. Maybe I'll do 4 inches spacing here. And then 7.5, 7.5, 7.5, and another 4 inches there, right? So that's the idea, is you're going to space. You've got 4 plants you're going to get in row, okay? And then the in-row spacing. This is something you're going to see on a lot of your seed packets, is in-row spacing. Hey, Lynn. So that's something you're going to see, is in-row spacing. So that's going to be your spacing in the row, okay? And then you're going to see on these seed packets as well, your spacing in between rows, right? So let's see, we have our next set. What is this spacing in between the first set, the first row, and the second row? Okay. So with my lettuce heads, what I typically do is I'll do 6 inches in between each row. So in between these rows, I'll do 6 inches, and I'll do that on every single one here. Okay, so this spacing is like, if you wanted massive lettuce heads, you could switch this, and you could do 3 per row. And all you have to do is you take 30 inches, right? And if you wanted 3 in the row, you would take 30 inches, and you would figure out the spacing in between each row based on the 30 inches. So just kind of switch it up that way, right? So if you wanted bigger heads, you could go with 3. I typically do 4 for lettuce heads. Now I'm going to talk about some other spacing. So this was just some lettuce head spacing to kind of give you an idea if you're trying to attempt to grow summer lettuce. Now I want to show you some intensive spacing, some really close, tight niche spacing, okay? And this is how I grow all my baby greens. So if you're trying to grow greens at home and you're trying to figure out, well, what's the closest I can get, shocked to see how close I plant everything. So typically what I'll do is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay, so for my baby lettuce, I'm gonna have 12 in a row, meaning I'm squeezing everything in there that I can. And my spacing on this, right? So I've got 12 in row, okay? And then my spacing on this is, I'm spacing it every 2 1/4 inch. So call it 2 inches. So they're 2 inches apart from each other, and there's 12 in a row, okay? Now let's look at our next row. So we're doing another 12 in this next spot. Now there's going to be a spacing in between. My spacing in between here is only a 1/2 inch. So I'm spacing everything really, really close together here. And this is intensive spacing. So this is spaced really, really close. So I've got my 12 in row, okay? My in row spacing. So my in row spacing, I've got everything spaced out 2 1/4 inch. And then my spacing from row to row is only a 1/2 inch, meaning I'm really packing it in here. And we grow a lot of our crops like this. So we grow our leaf lettuce like this, because when the lettuce is going to grow, it's not going to form a head because it's close, it's so close together. So when you go to the store and you buy those big jugs of baby spinach, baby lettuce. Well, the lettuce is typically leaf lettuce. It's not a head of lettuce. So this would be a way to grow that leaf lettuce that you see in the stores in these salad mixes. Now, I also grow arugula like this. If you want to grow baby kale instead of big kale, you can space it the same spacing here. Baby Swiss chard I'll space like this. Baby spinach, mustard greens that I want in the baby size, tatsoi, baby sorrel, baby watercress. These are all some of the things that I space at this very tight spacing. I also do bunching onions like this, where I'll space the bunching onions very, very close together. And as the onions grow, they'll be a perfect size because they're spaced so close. This is a good way if you're growing bunching onions. Bunching onions don't need to be as big as a regular onion. If you're growing a regular onion, I typically will use more of what I did on the previous one. So if I'm growing a big onion, I'll do 4 of them in row, just like the lettuce, and then I space them 6 inches apart and 6 inches apart in row. So depending on the crops you're growing would determine kind of that spacing. All right, so that's my like very, very intensive spacing, and this is how I grow all my baby stuff. So if you're out there and you're trying to figure out, well, how do these farms grow this baby stuff? Well, this is it. They just space it very close together. And a lot of times when you're doing this, typically, if you're a large scale farm, you typically have a seeder. Like most of these farms will purchase a seeder so they can direct seed all their crops. So they'll either get like a Jane seeder. Jane seeders are like $2,000-3,000. They're very expensive, but they do the best job placing those seeds in the soil at the exact spacing that you need. The one that we used was the Earthway seeder. It's a cheaper model. You have to kind of modify some of the plates to get it work with some of the smaller seeds to get that spacing right. But the Jane seeder is what a lot of these large scale farms use, and it's just a machine. So they'll just walk down the garden bed with this machine, and they'll load the seeds in the little compartment, and then the seeds, every turn of the wheel, a seed will pop out, and it'll pop out at the exact spacing that you're looking for, right? So I hope that makes sense. Yeah, so a lot of these farms, when they're doing their green seeding, they'll direct seed it. That's what we do. We direct seed a lot of our stuff. Saves you the time of having to put it in a soil block and then transfer it into the garden. When you're direct seeding something, it basically the roots attach to that ground and they hit the ground running. Where if you're having to transplant stuff, there's that process before the roots actually grab onto the soil and start growing. So there's kind of a lag where if you direct seed, it's an instant sort of thing. So with a lot of your greens, this is how you do it. I have a video that will be coming out in coming weeks where I talk about direct seeding, and I show you how I direct seed a bed of arugula. Okay, so that covers kind of the baby lettuce stuff, which I kind of put into its own sort of category. Is there anything you guys want to see? Is there any crops that you're getting ready to put in your garden right now and you're trying to figure out the spacing on those crops? The reason I ask is I have a list here, but this list is massive, and it's got all my crops from when we farmed up north, I put together a farm plan, and that's what I'm looking at. So if there's anything you guys want spacing on, shout it out. I kind of want to go through some of the spacing on the summer crops now. That was more focused on the greens, but I wanted to kind of now focus on like the cucumbers, the eggplant, the peppers, the summer squash, the winter squash, the melons, the tomatoes, like this stuff that we're putting in the ground right now. Strawberries. Good question, Lynn. Strawberries, you can space them pretty close together. I'd say about 6 inches would be cool. They're gonna have runners, so as you plant those strawberries in the ground, expect there to be these runners. Now, 6 inches would be like intensive spacing. If you wanted the strawberries bigger, go wider in your spacing. Go a foot, go 16 inches, something like that, which would give you real big strawberries. But if you're fine with just smaller strawberries, space it close together. If you're doing it in a grow bag, you're not going to have that problem. If you're doing it in a grow bag, just pop one in the grow bag in the center. And then as the runners, strawberries are cool because they have runners. So as the runners come out, snip the runners. So as the runners come out, you'll have a new runner that comes out, and that new runner, that new strawberry plant, you're going to want to, before you cut it off the plant, you're going to want to set it in some soil. When you set it in the soil, it's going to allow the strawberry plant to take root. Once it takes root, then you cut it, and then you put it in like a 1 gallon pot, or hold the additional strawberries, or you can replant them in the garden, whatever you want to do. So yeah, this farm that we farmed with up north, what they did was they had strawberries growing on a shelf up high, and then they had all the runners coming off of that shelf onto another shelf where they had just soil. So the strawberry vines would basically come down with the new strawberry plant. That new strawberry plant they would set in soil, and then they would let that strawberry plant root, and then they would move it into a different container, move it to a different area in the on the farm. So yeah, and that's why when you buy strawberry crowns, that's what they're giving you, is like a strawberry. Maybe sometimes it's a strawberry runner you're getting. But yeah, that's what I would do for strawberries. 6 inches if you want them really close, or you separate them. I mean, look at strawberries growing in the wild. They're not so much worried about spacing. All right, so yeah, let's talk about some of the summer stuff here. So I'll start with cucumbers. If there's anything you guys want to see, shout out. So typically with cucumbers, what I typically do is in a 30-inch bed, I'll just put 1 row of cucumbers. And I'll do the same thing with eggplant. Peppers, I don't, but I'll show you. So typically I'll do 1 row just down the center like this of cucumbers. Typically I'll space them out every 16 inches. Right? And then typically what I do with my cucumbers is I have to trellis them somehow. So that's why I always do 1 row, because I have to put something in here to actually trellis them. So then I'll put, a trellising system back here or something like that. So as they grow, they'll trellis up this way. But yeah, 16 inches is what I do for my cucumbers. Okay, let's do eggplant. So eggplant, very similar thing I do with eggplant is what I'll typically, like what I did this year is I have a half bed of eggplant and a half bed of peppers, and it seems to be doing very well. I'm going to show you how I did that one. So I've got my eggplant on this side of the bed. Okay, it's spaced out about 12, maybe a foot off the edge. And then I have it spaced out here every 18 inches. Okay, so then I've got my peppers going up here. So I'll have my peppers 1 foot off the edge. And then I space my peppers 1 foot from one another. And then they're just going across like that. And then my spacing in between here is, I think about 14 inches or so. My in-row spacing. So you could do something like that too. You don't have to just do one strip. This is just something that I'm trying out this year. A lot of stuff I do, I just try out, and then I note down from my experience what works and what doesn't work. And cucumbers always work at 16 inches. They do well. Eggplant, my first year doing eggplant, I spaced them out a foot, kind of like my peppers. And I noticed that my eggplant were small. So I wanted bigger eggplant. So what I ended up doing was spacing them out 18 inches, and that did the trick. So you'll learn what you want and what kind of food you like, and then you'll make adjustments every year. So that is what I do for my eggplant, and that's what I do for my peppers. Peppers is a foot apart. Eggplant is typically 18 inches apart. Let's see. Okay, we got a question. We got companion planting. So yeah, you can do companion planting. I'll tell you some of the stuff that we've done, and you might give it a go. So with I think everybody knows this one, doing basil with tomatoes. So I'll typically, with my tomatoes, if I'm doing basil in with the tomatoes, I'll space my tomatoes out further. So I'll show you that one. So tomatoes, I typically space out a foot apart. So they're very close together. So I typically will space my tomatoes a foot apart. But if I'm companion planting, so if I'm putting basil in the picture here, basil only needs spacing of 6 inches apart from another basil plant. So what I did was I took my next tomato plant and I actually put 24 inches in between. And then I snuck a basil plant dead center in between the two tomato plants. So that's something you could do with your tomato plants. If you're a companion plant, just make sure whatever that spacing in between is the same spacing that you would normally use for basil. So for basil, you want 6 inches spacing. So all you want to do is just make sure you got six inches in between those plants, which you got plenty of space here. And this worked very well for me at that sort of spacing. Now, another thing I did was I put ginger, use the same spacing. I planted ginger where that basil was, and it did very well. So that's another option. If you want to plant some ginger, you can companion plant that. I've also done onions with my tomatoes, and those have done very well, where I've done just a same sort of spacing, 24 inches. I think even one year I did 16 inches in between, and then I did bunching onions just a ½ inch apart, right in between. So a bunch of bunching onions right in between the tomatoes, and that did very well as well. I've also done regular onions in between, and I spaced it just like the basil. And then when I plant my onions, here's a little secret with planting your onions. When you start your onion seed, plant your onions in if you're using a soil block or if you're planting in the ground, to put a bunch of onions in that same hole. So I'll typically put like 6 onions in the hole, and then if all 6 sprout up, then I will thin out 2, and I typically want 4 onions to all grow together in one hole. So imagine this is my onion, my hole. I will put 1, 2, 3, 4. The goal is to get 4 plants growing in one hole. And then what you'll do is, as you're growing through the season, you'll notice that the onions, they all get to about a medium size. So they don't get those big, you won't get those big bulbs if there's 4 of them planted in one hole. But the secret is you take this one out and you eat it and call it a bunching onion. You take this one out, you eat it, you call it a bunching onion. Take that one out, you call it a bunching onions, and then you've got one left. Now you leave that one onion in there, and that one onion will get nice and big. And this you can do with a lot of crops. Like I've done this with turnips. I've done this with bunching onions. It's worked great with bunching onions. So this is something you can do with a lot of crops, where you just put them all in one hole. Basil does very well. Typically when I plant basil, I'll plant 3 seeds in one hole, and then I'll let all 3 of those plants just do whatever. I thin them out or cut them or anything. I just let them go. So so that's a little trick with onions. Onions, you typically want to start really early in the season. Like I typically will start mine. Those are one of the first things I start. I'll start those typically in like February, March, and then they would already be in the ground right now. But I don't have any onions because I'm working with a small amount of space here. But when we grew up north, we did a lot of onions, and this is how we did them. Let's see some other companion planting that I experimented with. I've planted flowers in with a lot of my stuff that needs to be pollinated by something, right? So you could plant stuff in with like your tomatoes or your eggplant or your cucumbers, the stuff that needs to be pollinated by something. Those flowers will then attract the beneficial insects to come in, pollinate the flower, and then they see these other plants within the same area, and they typically will sneak over and pollinate some of those plants too. One of the best pollinators out there, I wouldn't recommend a companion planting these, but if you plant some rosemary in an area of your garden bed, typically it will, when it goes to flower, it attracts a ton and a ton and a ton of bees. So how I design the farm up north is, so say these are my rows. This is like a wide out version of the entire farm, right? Okay, so this is row 1, row 2, and then this row right here is a row with flowers, herbs, stuff that really brings in the insects, and then you have another row here of just crops. But you want to do this, you want to set your rows up so whatever goes in this bed, this bed, this bed, this bed needs a pollinator in order to produce the fruit, right? So you could put squash in this bed, you could put winter squash in here, you could put tomatoes, you can put eggplant, you can put cucumbers, you can put tomatoes. These are the things that need a pollinator to pollinate the flower, right? So this is called like a hedgerow, where you have your your crops, and then in between crop rows you have other stuff planted that might bring in the bugs you want in the garden, like the bees. So that's one garden layout. That's what we did up up north. Is we planted a whole row of like lemon balm and thyme and oregano and stuff like that, that really brought in a lot of those bugs that we wanted in on the farm. All right, so let's talk about like the squashes: summer squash, winter squash. What do you space out something like that? So as we know, summer squash gets very big, right? So we want to give that plant enough space to grow nice and big, so then it can produce nice and big fruit. Now, for summer squash, zucchinis, patty pan squash, patty pan, they grow smaller, so you don't need as much space. But let's talk about summer squash. So with summer squash, I'll typically do them just in one row. So one row of one crop with my winter squash and my summer squash, because they take up so much darn space in that bed. So I'll typically just have one row going down the center, and I typically will space my my summer squash. This is intensive spacing. This is very close spacing. This is as close as I think you can go. I space 18 inches in between, and that's for summer. And then for my winter squash, what I do is I do 20 inches in between. So summer, winter squash, I space my winter squash a little bit further apart, just because the winter squash, they're going to produce a large amount of foliage. You know, they're sometimes they vine, and when they vine, they kind of take over the space. So summer squash, you'll notice, won't take up as much space, but summer squash will just go all over the place, especially if they're pumpkins. Pumpkins just spread like crazy. So that'd be my spacing on the summer and the winter squash, is something like that. Okay, so let's talk about some of the I've kind of walked you through tomatoes. Tomatoes, I do a foot in between. That's probably one a lot of people are growing, is tomatoes. I know if you're doing the medical medium stuff, you're probably eating a lot of melon. Maybe you're trying to grow a melon. Melon, I space very similar to the summer squash. I space 18 inches apart. Those also need a lot of heat. So if you're in a place that doesn't get a lot of heat, the melon's not going to do as well for you. You can always put down some black plastic over the bed to get more heat into that bed, but it does need a lot of heat. Likes hot soil. I've grown them here in the Bay Area, and they don't grow at all. So, or they did, but they got very small, which wasn't really too great. Hey, yeah, thank you. Yeah, it kind of is like a master class, right? Someone said, you're giving us a master class here. What a service to the community. Well, gardening shouldn't be something you should have to pay for. That's my feeling. I want as many people out there to grow food for themselves and their families. I mean, this is a big reason that we started doing these lives, is because if there, if what's to come is what's to come is what Anthony is talking about with these food shortages, you're going to need, this is a skill everybody's going to need. You're going to need to know how to grow your own food. Don't wait until the food shortages are here and then all of a sudden decide, oh, I better start gardening, right? Learn the stuff now, because you only get one season to try new things out. And then every year you have failures and you learn from those failures. So when you you try new things one season, it's not like you can just start over the next week and do it all over again. You got to wait till the next summer to try some of those things that that you didn't do the previous summer. So start now. Start now. Get some seeds, get some soil, and start growing stuff. Um, I talked about like kale, baby. I talked about baby kale, right? But if you wanted the large kale, large leaves, the large leaf kale, you would space them further apart. So I'm going to go through spacing on kale. I'm going to go through spacing on Swiss chard, collard greens. This is the spacing I use for a lot of this stuff. So I already got my circles made here. So for kale, I typically will space my kale plants out. If I want a full, big head of kale, I'll space them 12 inches apart. And I'll typically have 3 in a row. So in a bed I'll have 10-inch spacing in row. And then in between row to row, you're going to do a foot, right? So 3 in row, spaced 10 inches apart in row, and then 12 inches from row to row, okay? You're going to follow this same thing you're going to do the same thing, 12 inches for collard greens, and you're going to do the same thing, 12 inches, following the same method here, okay, with Swiss chard. Cool. So 3 in row, spaced 10 inches apart in between the plants, a foot from row to row to row to row. And that's how I would do my Swiss chard, collard greens, and kale. If you want the big version of it, right? Now, a big reason we do this, a big reason that we plant them the way we plant them so close together, is because as they grow, the leaves should touch each other. And as the leaves touch each other, they form this canopy. And when the canopy is formed, it then protects the bed, right? Because if the sun is not beating up on that bed all day, that's a good thing for the bed. And it's a good thing for preventing weeds, right? Because weeds pop up because the sun allows those weeds to grow. So if it's shaded from the leaves touching each other, creating this canopy, those weeds are not going to grow. It's going to keep your soil nice and moist, which then is going to be good for the life that lives underneath the soil. So that's how I would do those crops. Let's see what else we got here. All right, yeah, let's talk about some of the other stuff that is kind of big with if you're eating the medical medium way. These are some crops that we typically eat a lot of, and that would be cilantro. It goes every day in that heavy metal detox smoothie. So growing your own cilantro would be an important thing for survival. Dill and parsley. Dill, I love putting dill in salads. We put cilantro in salads. We put parsley in salads. We put the parsley in our smoothies. All important things. And I kind of space them all out the same. So I'll walk you through my spacing on that. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. 4 in a 30-inch bed. Okay. And then I space them I space them 6 inches apart from one another. Okay. And then we're going to go over to our next row. Same thing. Okay, but our spacing in between row to row is also going to be 6 inches. Okay. So this is my spacing on herbs. And that's just because I like the herb leaves to be nice and big. So the spacing here isn't as tightly spaced as some of the other herbs that we grow, but it's I think this is the perfect spacing for cilantro, dill, and parsley. So yeah, those are the herbs. I also use this same spacing for basil. So if you're trying to grow basil, I typically will space basil the same way, 6 inches in row, 6 inches in between row to row. Let's see if what other ones, if I'm missing any here that I also do like that. Okay, cool. So that covers a lot of those herbs. I mean, there's a lot of other herbs we do too, but those are basil indoors. Oh, just asked your question, you answered it. Okay, how do you keep basil alive, indoors alive? Well, the problem with the basil indoors is you need airflow on it. And so you want to keep it by a window, and you want to allow that window to be open at different times of the day so you can keep the air flowing through that room. We will buy that basil that you get in the supermarket that you can just pick yourself. And a lot of times when you're picking your basil yourself on like a shelf, a lot of times if you're not getting enough air, then the basil starts to turn bad on you. Or if you're giving it too much water, that's another reason. These are just things that I've had to talk to Ashley about because she's kind of the basil keeper in the garage. And a lot of times I'll walk by and I'll say, "Hey, what's going on with this basil plant?" So we've had to cure some very sick basil plants. But so with basil though, a trick with the basil. Okay, so when the basil grows, it'll get to a certain size. Okay, and what you're going to want to do when you pick your basil plants, yeah, see, totally, yeah, you get it. I keep killing it, and I'm trying to save them. It's hard. It's hard. Yeah, you got to give it that perfect amount of everything. But with basils, when they grow to a certain height, the height you want them, you want to top them, and then when you top them, they bush out. Okay, so this is if you're growing them in a garden bed. You have 6 inches in between, so the basil will grow, and then when you get to that height you want them at, you top them, and where you top them is you'll see a this is not a basil, this is a ground cherry, but I'm gonna just kind of show you. So you'll see the leaf, and then in between the leaf you'll have new growth coming out. So where that new growth is coming out is where you want to cut, because when you cut right above that new growth, now the plant, you're telling the plant you want it to bush out. So anytime you top something, it naturally is going to bush outward. So you want to find new growth. This is also when you're harvesting your basil plant and you want to keep it alive. Go down to where the new growth is, cut it the top there, and then that will allow for new growth from the plant. All right, and then I've got root crops. I've got radish, turnip on the list, carrots. If you're doing medical medium, you grow a lot of potatoes. I've got potatoes. So let's kind of do let's do that one. I'm gonna try to do it on the same board here. So radish. So with radish, what I typically do is I do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 6 in a row on a 30-inch. 5 inches in between. Now, I will tell you, I've even done 3 inches, but I think this is the best amount because I don't want the radish to be too small. I want the radish to have enough room to grow and get to a good size. And then what I do in between them, so the next one over, I'll do 1 1/4 inch. And this is how I do my radish. Okay, so let's talk about turnips. I'll do this one I do a lot. So turnips I do 9 in a row. So 9 in row. This one was 6 in row. So 9 in row. And I'll typically space my turnips 3 inches. So 3 inches in between. And then to my next bed of turnips, I'll do the same thing I do is 1 1/4 inch, right? So turnips, I've even experimented where I direct seed most of my turnips and radishes. So radishes and turnips, I always direct seed. So rather than putting them in the greenhouse and then putting them in the ground, I just direct seed them right into the soil. If their spacing is off, I go through with scissors and I cut them, I thin them out, so then my spacing is accurate. With radishes, you don't want to have like 2 radishes within like a ½ inch of each other because they're going to compete for growth. And when they compete for growth, one's going to win and one's going to lose, but really they both lose because they both don't get big enough. With turnips, I've noticed when you direct seed them, like I've direct seeded a whole bed of them, and then I didn't thin them out at all, and they basically turned out to be the perfect size. So turnips, sometimes I'll thin them out, sometimes I won't, but most of the time I'm using the way I seed, I try to space them, using this 3 inch spacing in row, and that I'm pretty spot on with my turnips once they come up. So I'm not just like throwing them on the bed and then just watching them grow. I'm actually trying to keep them 3 inches apart. So, but I wouldn't go out there with a tape measure and like measure them out and stick them in that way. That's going to take a lot of time. Just mark out your row. So typically what I'll do is I'll come in with a rake or a stick or something, and I'll mark out my rows. So I'll mark out my rows first, and then I'll pop seeds in that row, and then I'll come back and I'll cover all those seeds up. And then when you direct seeding, you're going to want to keep stuff moist. So you're going to want to water it all the time. You're going to want to water in the morning and in the afternoon until that stuff starts to take off and starts to grow. Once that stuff starts to grow and it gets big enough, then you're not going to need to water it as much. It's only when you're establishing the plant and it's first growing that you're going to have to keep a lot of water on it because it does like the moisture. Okay, so that's radish and turnips. Let's do carrots next. So with carrots, what I do is I do 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I do 5 in row, and then I space them every 6 inches. Okay, and then in between these, I do the same thing, 1 1/4 inch. Okay, that's carrots. All right, what other root crops? Let's do some potatoes. Okay, potatoes. So there's 2 types of potatoes. You can grow the baby potatoes or the big potatoes. I'm going to talk about the big ones. So the big ones, what I'll typically do is I'll do 3 in row, And then I'll space them out every 10 inches. You could also space them out to a foot, depending on how big you want these potatoes. And then the spacing in between, I do 6 inches. So that's like these are the root crops that I typically grow are these guys. So hopefully that makes sense. So yeah, you just have, what do you want to, when you're thinking of this, you're just thinking, okay, what is my spacing in row? And what is my spacing in between rows, in between the rows? And if you follow this sort of methodology when you're thinking of planting your garden, it makes planting your stuff very easy. You're not just guessing. A lot of times when you're guessing, you might not get the full crop you wish you had. I've planted a lot of stuff way too close together, and it never turned into anything. Yeah, I think that's kind of it for this plant spacing, unless there's stuff you guys want to see. I'll just ramble off a couple ones that I didn't talk about. Cauliflower and broccoli, depending on how big you want it, but 2 in row, and then I'll space 14 inches in row, and then 18 inches in between. I'll draw it out. So I'll do 2 in row. My spacing in between will be 14 inches. And then my spacing to my next row is 18 inches. So it looks like that. Now I do this for cauliflower. I do this for broccoli. I do this for Brussels sprouts. I do them for those crops because they need a lot of space, and they also need a lot of fertilizer. So broccoli and cauliflower, as soon as that head starts to form, you want to give that crop some nice fertilizer to get that head nice and big. That's when you go to the store and you see those big heads, that's why, because they're fertilizing the heck out of that plant, Cauliflower key, because if you want a really white head, what I typically do is I'll take the top leaves and I'll take a rubber band or a string and I'll tie it around the head. So those leaves will then shade the head and keep that head nice and blanched, nice and white. And then Brussels sprouts, yeah, they need a lot of fertilizer. That's one that needs, I think, more fertilizer than broccoli and cauliflower. Okay. And then probably the one that everybody eats a ton of, celery. Important. We should all be growing our own celery. I'm going to do a video on celery one of these days, and I'm going to show you guys how I grow my celery. It does grow during the summer here, so it's going to have to be a winter video, but I'm going to do a celery video. I'm going to show you how to grow good celery and blanch your celery. When you blanch your celery, that's how you get that celery, that lighter color, and it's not as bitter. A lot of people, when you grow your own celery, it's always really bitter. And the store-bought ones always taste a lot better, and it's because we're not blanching it. So that'll be part of that video. But for celery, I do 1, 2, 3. My in-row spacing is 12 inches. 12 inches. And then my in-between row is also 12 inches. So celery looks like that. Yeah. And then what I do for celery is I dig trenches. So when I'm putting it in, I basically will kind of hard to draw, but I dig a trench like this, and then I'll actually dig a really deep trench in here, and then I bury the celery along that row in a deep trench. And then when the celery grows towards the end, you can just take all that dirt and you push it on the base of the celery, and that will help with the blanching process. Okay, so that's celery. And then no one's growing a lot of garlic right now because it's not the season. I talked about onions. Onions I do the same way as leeks. Leeks and onions go in the same category. I do 6-inch spacing in between. And then I do 6 inches. So I do 6 inches in row, and then spacing between rows, I do 6 inches there too. So, yep. And that's for leeks in onions. And for leeks, I do the same thing as onions. I plant a bunch of them in that hole. And then what I'll do with leeks is when they're about 2 months old, I will actually dig them up and I'll separate all those different plants, and then it'll turn into, like, say I had 12 in there, I'd separate all 12 leek plants in different areas of the garden. And leeks, like onions, if you pull the onions out of the spot they're in and replant them, they don't necessarily go through a shock period like most of these other plants do. Okay, so yeah, so that's it. That's it for the seed spacing. So I'm hoping that this was helpful. This was something I struggled with when I was first getting going with farming, was understanding the concept of in-row spacing and how many per row and how big my beds have to be, and my spacing for my walkways, and with how we do things, I have to have everything really close. So if you don't want stuff small, you can adjust those rows. It's not going to hurt your plants if you grow with a bigger space. I pick this spacing because I want that canopy effect. I want it to help the soil as it grows. So, okay, and then I have some questions written down here from. There were some questions on YouTube. There were some questions on Instagram over the course of this week. So I'm going to answer some of these questions. So the first question is, what plants can I grow in a 2-gallon pot? Okay, so most plants, most plants do well in 5-gallon pots. That's kind of like the minimum for most all plants is 5 gallons. But 2 gallons, you can grow a lot of stuff. Typically, what I'll say is, in a 2-gallon pot, anything that can be spaced 6 inches. 6 inches is probably the diameter of a 2-gallon pot. So you can get away growing any of these crops that we just talked about that have a spacing of 6 inches. So a lot of greens: lettuce, arugula, kale, Swiss chard, collard greens, spinach, mustard, tatsoi, beet greens, beets, sorrel, watercress, mosh, bok choy, basil, cilantro, dill, parsley, carrots, radish, turnips. I'm growing potatoes right now in 1-gallon containers, and that's working out just great. So potatoes would be okay. Kohlrabi, I would say it's questionable. Kohlrabi. I wouldn't grow cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels sprouts. I wouldn't grow cucumbers, eggplant. I would grow peppers. I grew peppers in 1-gallon containers, and they were awesome. I got so much fruit from peppers, and they were just in these little 1-gallon containers. These little containers like this, 1 gallons. And I grew a ton of peppers last year. And this year I'll probably end up doing the same because I'm going to run out of run out of space here eventually, and that's going to be my solution, is just throwing them in these 1 gallon pots. So peppers would be a really good one. You can't really grow summer squash, winter squash. I'd say those need at least a 10 gallon container or more. Really everything, those big crops like a summer squash, winter squash, 15 gallon would be like ideal for those crops that you want to get nice and big. You could probably even grow melons in 10, 15 gallon containers, but you need a lot of heat, so you got to get the heat going with those. I've grown tomatoes in these 1 gallon containers. The fruit is just very small. So if the fruit to be big, then you want to go with at least a 5 gallon container. And that's what I grow on my shelf that I have here. They're all grown in 5 gallon containers, and they turn out to be a good size. If you're growing cherry tomatoes, doesn't matter, but I wouldn't grow a big tomato in a 2 gallon container. Peas would do fine. Get some bush beans. Bush beans would be okay. Onions would be fine. Bunching onions, leeks, garlic. Those would all be cool. So it's just the kind of the bigger stuff that it might not work in those 2 gallon pots. Okay, another question was, why did all my plants die? Well, there could be a lot. It could be a lot of things there, but depends on where you got the plants. Did you direct seed them, or did you put them, get them as a transplant and then try to transplant them? Because plants will get a shock if they're being transplanted from a nursery into your garden bed. They will go through like that shock period, and that could kill a plant. Not enough water. When a plant is first being planted, you need to make sure it has enough water. So I always water it once in the morning, and then I check it in the afternoon to make sure that it has enough water. This is actually a question that someone asked: how much water do your plants need? So this is going to answer that question. When a plant is first being established, you need to make sure you're giving it enough water. Once it's established itself, then it's going to have, you're not going to have to water it as much, because the root system is a lot greater. The plant is a lot bigger, so it can deal with stress a lot more once the plant is a lot bigger. But when it's first starting out, that could be a reason. Another reason, if you're planting your plants in the heat of the day, if you're planting them at like 2 o'clock in the afternoon and it's really hot out, and you put them in the ground, there's a chance you're going to lose them because of the heat, because it's too hot. And if the plant is too hot, then it's not going to grow. So when I transplant stuff in the garden, I always do it in the evening, right around this time. You'll see me out here at like 6, 7 o'clock, and that's when I do all my planting. Or I do it really early in the morning, but mainly I try to do it in the evening, because then it gives that plant the whole evening time to adapt to the environment and get used to where it's at. And then the sun rises, and it can withstand the elements a lot better. I also harden off everything. So if it's grown in a greenhouse, you want to put it outside, let it harden off. Hardening off is basically you just allowing that plant to adapt to the environment. So pulling it out of the greenhouse, putting it in the environment it's gonna be in, and letting it adjust before it goes in the ground. Okay, so that is something that I would look into while your plants die. The other thing is, I do get plants that even if I follow all my directions and I plant it, the leaves will turn this white color, and you'll think like, oh no, my plant is like got a fungus or it's dying off or something like that. It's not. And the new growth, you'll see the new growth coming up from the top, and that new growth, you'll notice that new growth is not the same color, and that's just like sunburn. Your plants get sunburnt just like we get sunburnt, and that's all that is. So it's not a fungus. It's nothing that nothing alarming, but that could be a reason the plants die. The other thing is insects. If the plant is weak, If it's weak, then it's not going to, the plant is weak, then when you put it in the ground, it's going to be more susceptible to these bugs attacking it. Because what do bugs like? They go after, you look at like a kale plant growing, typically those bugs are going to attack those bottom leaves, because bottom leaves are the leaves that are kind of dead. They're dying off, right? So the bugs go after the weaker plants. So grow strong plants, then you're not going to have that problem when they go in the ground. So that could be another thing. Sometimes I'll go out and I'll look in the garden and something has like eaten the top of my, like I'll put a winter squash in and something will come and just snip the top of the winter squash. And that could be a bug. Okay, so those are some things on why I think the plants might have died in your situation. But go get some seeds. You can direct seed stuff right now, so don't think that it's a complete loss. Get some seeds, direct seed some seeds, and or just go get some more starts. Either or. What's the best way to control weeds? Good question. So what I found over the years is minimum tillage, meaning when you're turning your beds too much, you're turning seed that's in those beds. When you turn that seed that's in those beds, it's allowing that seed to move, and then you're giving that bed water. And when you give it the water, now you're allowing those seeds to now grow. So minimum tillage. I'm not tilling the bed. I'm tilling only that top 6 inches of soil. I'm not, digging down as deep as I can into that bed and then turning it. I'm trying to just till like that top part of the soil. But I definitely till. I don't do no-till techniques. I definitely till, but it's very minimal tillage. The other way is what we've been talking about, properly spacing your plants. By properly spacing your plants will form this canopy. The leaves will touch. Now, when the leaves touch, that will put shade on the soil, which then will allow the weed pressure to not be as great. The other thing I do, and I do this with all my heavy feeding crops, the crops that are going to be in the garden for an extended period of time, those are the crops that I do this with. And any sort of yard waste I have, I throw it on the bed. So if I cut out a bed of arugula, I will throw all that arugula waste right onto the bed where the pepper and the eggplants are growing, or where my squash is growing, because that will then protect the soil. By protecting the soil, it's going to keep the life underneath the soil happy. It's also going to prevent the weeds from popping up. And so what we do here when we compost, we get a ton of compost because of how we eat. And I have Ashley separate the 2 bags. So I have one bag with all our fruit, and then I have another bag with all of our green waste. Green waste would be like celery pulp or cucumber pulp, or maybe we pick a bunch of arugula and we pick too much and some of it goes bad. We throw that in that bucket. Maybe we cut the tops off some carrots. That goes in the bucket. So there's 2 separate piles. Now the green waste, I just spread out on all those beds. I'm talking about heavy feeders. I'm talking about these beds where, like when you plant summer squash, for example, that plant is going to get big. But there's a period of time from when you put that plant in the soil to where it gets big, where the leaves are not going to form that canopy. So there's a period of time where the soil is not protected. So by taking the green waste you have around the yard and throwing that on those beds, you're now protecting the soil and you're feeding the soil, which is most important. Because as those leaves break down, those minerals and the vitamins and the nutrients in the leaves will actually go into your beds. So you're feeding your plants while those plants are breaking down on those beds. You're protecting them, you're keeping the soil moist, and you're preventing weeds from popping up, which was the question that was asked. So yeah, so there's 4 questions. That's all I have. So if there's any other questions, pop them in right now, and I'll try to answer them. But I hope this was helpful. We I really wanted to do this video early on, and I know like everybody is probably getting their stuff in the ground right now. If you're in a northern region, you're definitely probably getting your stuff in the ground right around now. We've had our stuff in the ground for quite some time, but even if you miss this, I'm sure stuff's going to grow, and you're going to need to pull it out and put new stuff back in. And at least now you know the proper spacing for everything. So if you have more questions, pop them in. If not, I'm going to wrap this up. And then if you have questions, you can always ask them in the comment section on our YouTube page. That gardening channel is the channel that we've been live streaming from. And then we're also streaming on our Instagram page, which is that.root.life. That's our Instagram page. And if you have questions, you can ask us on Instagram. You can ask us on YouTube. I do garden coaching. If you want a garden coaching session, it's very affordable. You can find that on our website at thatrootlife.com. It's for a half hour. It's on a sliding scale. It's like $25 for a half hour, all the way up to $45. So it depends on how much you want to donate. It's on a donations basis. So if you can't afford that, message me anyway. We'll work something out. So hope this was helpful. We'll be back next week. I'll do another one. Videos coming this week. We'll have a video out probably tomorrow, and it's going to be covering how I plant all of my heavy feeders. So after they're in this 1-gallon pot and they go into the ground, a little trick that I use to make sure that the plant that goes in the ground gets extra fertilizer so it gets its food to maintain that long-term growth. That's one video. I'm going to do another video coming out this week on that gardening channel about feeding the soil. And it's actually a lot about what we just talked about, how you're dumping all your waste on the garden beds to feed the soil. So that will be part of it. And then on that Root Life YouTube station, if you didn't see our video we uploaded this week, it was a great video done with Josh Eldridge. Josh had gone through some pretty severe health problems, colitis, IBS, Crohn's disease, a lot of stomach related issues. And the first video that came out was him sharing his story dealing with conventional medicine. So if you're out there struggling, or you know someone out there struggling with these symptoms or conditions, that would be a great video to share with them in hopes that they'll use some of the information that Josh did to heal himself. So that's a good video. Go check that out. There'll be another one coming this week with Josh, and he'll be talking about some of the trendy diets out there. When he was really sick, he tried everything. He tried every trendy diet you can think of. This guy tried, and you have to watch the video that's coming this week, and you'll see what happened to him from trying these trendy diets that unfortunately didn't work for him. So stay tuned for that this week. Otherwise, appreciate you coming on and spending Friday night with me. We'll see you guys next Friday. I'll do another one next Friday. We'll see you then. Have a good night. Bye.